Hi, welcome back to Module 2. So what we're going to talk about in this module are the fact that there are only 7 archetypal stories in the world, literally. Doesn't matter how original a story looks, there really are only 7. And we're going to cover those 7, and you're going to see on the screen will pop up occasionally. I'm going to give some examples of films that I've talked about to do it. But the very first story, and the great story that many of George Lucas's films were based on, is the hero's journey. And the hero's journey was also talked about by Joseph Campbell. And George Lucas, I once worked out of the Lucas's offices at the Egg Company across from Universal Studios back in the 80s after The Gray Fox. And the thing that he was known for is that, according to rumor I heard, was that he was greatly influenced by Joseph Campbell's hero's myth, and he talked about it. But if we take a look at the characters over the years that have done this kind of work, in the hero's journey, many of the films, the James Bond films, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which also covers into another category, but these are films in which our character, the great film Network, for instance, when Mr. Beale says, I'm sick and tired, I'm not going to take this anymore, he goes up against the establishment and he decides that that's it. I can't take life the way it is anymore, and he begins to reach out in front of it. Also, you want to take a look at films like Atomic Blonde with Charlize Theron. She does an amazing job as a female heroine who actually sets out to try to save back in the, it appears in the Cold War, but the idea that she has to escape and get someone out of Eastern Europe away from whoever it is that's trying to kill them. And what she has to go through, and it's really a violent film, quite frankly, but it's actually one of the better films in that genre that I've ever seen made. So the second is The Quest. And The Quest, you know, and I'm going to have to cover these fairly quickly. These are, because of the nature of the way in which this course is taught, I may end up doing an advanced screenwriting course depending on whether or not you like this introductory one, and in that one I would spend a great deal more time defining these characters, but really at this point it's just to familiarize you with the fundamental concepts so that you can apply them in your story. So the second is The Quest, and The Quest is, as I mentioned previously, Raiders of the Lost Ark. It has both elements, which makes it so interesting. The hero's journey, that he has to go in and try to save this incredible artifact that was so important to the Jewish religion, being the Ark of the Covenant. And the fact that what we're seeing with our main character, Harrison Ford, is that he is on a quest to help solve these problems. And of course, the wonderfully horrible characters that he has to come up against are the SS, the German, familiar for many people from the Second World War, that were just the epitome of evil, and men and women that would do anything to further the aims of the Führer. And in this case, the whole German hierarchy was based on a great deal of what was known as, they were into the occult. That was the bottom line. Much of Hitler's inner circle was extremely involved. And so Raiders of the Ark take us on a very interesting journey. And if you've never seen the film, I can't imagine you haven't, but if you haven't, you need to look at these films. The first is by far the best. The second and third are pretty good. They're not quite as cutting edge or as original. And the other thing I want to say to you is that many of them are actually based on, and this is my theory, in the 30s and 40s, they had a thing called serials, and they would leave you with a hanging at the end of each act, at the end of each episode, and you would go to theaters and see these short films. I've never was old enough to do that, but I was told about them, and I went to see them later on. And many of the elements in Raiders of the Lost Ark are like that, where they leave you hanging at the edge of a certain act with a cliffhanger of an end. Also, the next idea is travel and return, and probably the most classic one of these in recent years was in Back to the Future. And Back to the Future was a really well-crafted film directed by Robert Zemeckis, and you know, it was the early part of the career after Michael came off of a series that he'd been on for quite a few years, and he incorporated in it the the part of having to go back into the past and influence his upbringing by making sure that his mother and father, who he saw meet when they were teenagers, got together, because it turns out his dad is a complete kind of a nebbish kind of a character. And so his influence in the great scene when he plays the guitar, and this amazing African-American musician picks up the phone and telephones and says to the classic American guitar player and singer, whose name completely escapes me at the moment, but he's Chuck Berry. And he says, "Chuck, you've got to hear this kid play." And he sits there playing Chuck Berry riffs. And you get the idea that he's inspired Chuck Berry to move ahead in these great stories. The next is comedy. That's the fourth story. And there are some really good comedies. One of the great, I think, that came out of the Great Britain in the last decade or so was Love Actually, because it has underneath the comedy, and every comedy is fundamentally got a great deal of drama to make it really work. Again, it's this idea of contrasting characters. You want to have a comedy that has a heart to it. So there has to be a lesson learned in that kind of a film. And in it, our main character is going to learn that he loves this woman who's his assistant in spite of the fact that she may be imperfect and she's not a model. And you know, Hugh Grant's character, I think, is quite wonderful. And again, in Hugh Grant's story, the pivotal point at which he gets turned around is that he comes up against a really kind of nasty American president, played by none other than a guy that I find personally I have a difficult time liking. And I won't say too much about him, other than he's an interesting character and you want to watch it. But Love Actually has a really nice subtext to it about what's really important in life, with family, with relationships, and it's just a great fun film. One of the funniest I've ever seen is Hangover. And Hangover is just populated by these absolutely crazy contrasting characters, including the one Asian individual who's hiding in the trunk of a car when they open the door. I don't know where he was supposed to come from, but it's just funny when the dentist ends up losing one of his teeth, when he ends up being married to some showgirl that he doesn't know, and the three of them just end up in this one predicament after another. But the whole show is about what happens when they're trying to get home or get back to their hotel, when they're trying to resolve the problem to get back for the wedding. So every step along the way, they are stopped by the events that transpire with all of these people. Remember, I said to you, you always have to have obstacles in the way of your main characters achieving their goal. So Hangover, if you have not seen that movie, I really recommend it. The fifth is the Rebirth story. And there are several rebirth stories, and I want to start with one of the most award-winning television streaming services, and that was Breaking Bad. And Bryan Cranston had come off of Malcolm in the Middle, which is this white bread, homogenous, middle-class series based on a family. And he goes into this character of a drug-producing individual who's terminally ill, but is somehow got to make a financial rewards for his family so that he can leave. And it is one of the most darkest series I've ever seen in my life. I can't watch it because it's so dark, except when I watch it, I am just amazed at the writing of it, and I'm amazed at the acting in it. And Bryan Cranston, of course, went on to do the great story on Dalton Trumbo, one of the greatest writers in the history of American cinema, that was blacklisted in the 50s in the witch hunt, the McCarthy witch hunt era. So his talent is just extraordinary. The next one for the rebirth is, of course, the classic, Christmas classic, It's a Wonderful Life. And that is the one in which shows the positive and the opposite end of Bryan Cranston's character, who wishes he didn't live and wants to commit suicide, and is given the opportunity to see how the world would have turned out without his presence. And George is this character that is lovable, played by Jimmy Stewart, and his wife and family, Donna Reed, and these kids. And you get to see an American classic by one of America's greatest directors. And it also shows, again, a very simple lesson. And it's really at its heart, it's about family, forgiveness, and self-acceptance. And so most of these films have a subtext to them which covers these basic areas. The sixth is Rags to Riches. And Rags to Riches has been done in a number of ways. A classic fairy tale kind of story, of course, is Cinderella. And Cinderella, it goes up against her evil stepmother and her evil stepsisters. And we never know, is she going to be accepted? Is she going to be able to work out a solution? Is the prince ever going to meet her? All of these obstacles that keep coming out are put in the way. A more modern version was a film called Working Girls that had Harrison Ford, Melanie Griffith, and Sigourney Weaver. And it too really is about someone that comes out and ends up, it's really the fish out of water story. It's someone who ends up with just an enormous amount of success and money in their lives, and yet the background would never have predicted they would have done this. So this is a great, wonderful venue to work in. And of course, the seventh is Tragedy, and one of the greatest films made in the last 25 years by a wonderful Canadian director, of course, was Titanic. And Titanic just gave us a chance to witness a story through a whole new prism, a new lens that many people had no idea of how far or what was like at the moment of the surrender, because there had been another movie made in the 50s that did not have, and the word of the day is verisimilitude, the appearance of truth. That Titanic was a remarkable story, and the characters in it were just so well cast, and it was so well directed, and it was so beautifully shot that at the end you could not do anything but feel incredible compassion and empathy. So those are examples. There's many others in all those categories. Schindler's List, even though it had an uplifting ending in the sense that Schindler himself would end up saving countless millions of Jews. I mean, it's just a horrific. And again, you know, we had these characters that were played that just contrasted one another. But there's so many, a variety of these films, especially around tragedy, that have worked. And some of the greatest classics, the Greek tragedies, have all been adapted over the years in a variety of films. So the question I leave you with at this section is, which story will you write? And, you know, it's important for you to research and to open up and look at some more details, because in the length of time I have to be able to share this with you, I'm not able to do that to the degree that I would if I were doing a 3-hour lecture. So the thing is that I would recommend you go and you do some Google research on the 7 characters, just look them up and start looking at what stories, and here's the key that I would say if you want to be successful. What are the films you like? What are the shows you like? And also, feature films are very difficult to do right now. The only stories that I know of really being made are the big studio pictures based on Marvel Comics or Disney, their own version of that. But where the golden age of television is right now is in streaming services and the cable networks. And while the traditional networks are trying to be a little more groundbreaking, they're never going to get near, because they're regulated by the FCC, and they cannot use the kind of language or situations that audiences seem to be thirsty for today. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll move on to Module 3, and we'll see what's coming up there.